Today we're going to be looking at some of the incredible chess that is being produced almost daily by one of the most promising young players that I've seen since Magnus Carlsen showed up on my radar when he was only 13 years old. I remember thinking at the time, this kid is going to be world champion someday. Well, now I've got that feeling once again as I look at some of the brilliancies being produced by the 10-year-old Argentinian sensation Faustino Oro. He has only been playing chess for 4 years, but in that time he's become the youngest international master in history, achieving a FIDE rating of 2434. So he's achieved a higher rating in a shorter amount of time than Magnus did when he was learning how to play, and he is now consistently scoring wins against some of the very best players on earth. On chess.com, he just defeated Hikaru Nakamura 2 more times in Bullet on September 14th, so we're going to take a quick look at those games, but then I want to show you one of his most beautiful games he's played recently against the 2900 blitz player, an international master by the name of Vugar Manafov, which I'm calling a masterpiece. I just love some of the moves he plays, and I don't know what to make of his playing style yet. Is he going to be more like Fischer, Kasparov, or Carlsen, or even Morphy? I'll let you decide, but let's get into this first bullet game against Hikaru Nakamura, who is playing white and begins with e4. And from Faustino, we have a Caro-Kann defense, and we get this 2 knights variation as it's called, the pawns being exchanged on e4, and now knight to d7 from Faustino. Preparing knight to f6, which if white captures on f6 will allow the knight to be replaced with a knight as opposed to doubling the pawns. Knight to g3 now from Hikaru, opting to drop the knight back as opposed to capturing on f6 after Faustino's next move, knight g to f6, since that capture would just aid black in his development, opening up lines for his bishop as well as his queen. So dropping this knight back is a popular thing to do in this variation, although playing d4 first is a bit more normal. Next we have bishop to c4, e6, preparing to develop the bishop in castle. e5 would be a bit too risky since white could open up the position with d4 and would be the favored side with the better development and being closer to castling than black is, which is what Hikaru does next. And we have bishop to d6, rook to e1, all normal development requiring no commentary whatsoever besides saying that it requires no commentary. Queen to c7 now, very natural, pointed at the king side. c3 from Hikaru, supporting the center, opening up the c2 square for a piece, maybe the queen, maybe the bishop, maybe set up some kind of a battery towards the black king side. h6 now from Faustino, and I'm assuming he doesn't want any bishop to g5, threatening to capture on f6 and damage the pawn structure if this knight were to stray away from the defense. Next is queen to c2 and rook to e8, a natural developing move, which is fine. The engine keeps suggesting c5, maybe it's a bit better, but no significant problems with any of these moves so far. a4 now from Hikaru, secures the bishop's position on c4, preventing the b5 expansion from black with tempo. So b6 played instead, preparing to develop the light squared bishop to b7, bishop to d3 now from Hikaru. The engine is not impressed with this move. It prefers knight to e4 right away, but Hikaru does play it on his next move after bishop to b7, but here it's apparently not as good because after knight takes e4, because of this move bishop to d3, you cannot capture with the queen, which the engine says is best. And then if the queen is hit with knight to f6, you can slide over to h4 with some very dangerous attacking prospects, up to and including a potential bishop sacrifice on h6. So that was the best way to attack, but in the game, Hikaru has to capture on e4 with the bishop or the rook. Bishop takes e4 is best, but Hikaru goes for the throat now with rook takes e4, which gets maximum marks for aggression, but for accuracy, not so much. The main problem for white here is the move c5, which Faustino seems committed not to play, even though it continues to be his best move. Here it's especially effective, with the discovered attack on the rook, and then threatening to shatter the pawn structure around the white king once the rook moves. You could try rook to e3 to defend that way, but then there's bishop to f4, so that's not working. But Faustino plays knight to f6, attacking the rook that way, which is not nearly as strong, although this position still does favor black. We have rook to h4 now. This is Hikaru's big idea. Sacrifices are in the air. c5 is played, so queen to e2 adds defense to the knight. Good move, but after rook a to d8, Hikaru decides to force the issue. he's decided to punish this youngster whether he deserves it or not. Usually not a great idea in chess, or in life in general. The punishment really needs to be appropriate to the transgression. A sacrifice has to be justified, but in this case, bishop takes h6, now played by Hikaru, is just not gonna fly. Not even in bullet, because Faustino is not gonna be intimidated. He fearlessly recaptures the bishop with g takes h6, inviting rook takes h6. He doesn't believe Hikaru at all, and just attacks that rook with king to g7, totally confident that Hikaru just does not have the right kind of firepower, properly primed and ready to go to make this work. He would need to get his queen involved somehow and would love to get her to the g5 square. So what does he do? He plays queen to e3, threatening queen to g5, which would lead to a mate in 5, which is all good and well, except for the minor issue of bishop to f4. And of course, when I say minor, I mean minor in the grand scheme of things. Within the confines of this game, however, this is pretty much the most disastrous thing you could experience as white, as it essentially eliminates any realistic hope of not losing this game. And so Hikaru resigns. So a major tactical failure by Hikaru here. Not sure exactly how to explain it except to say that this is bullet. But let's take a look at the next encounter between these two. Played on the same day, Hikaru again has white, and we again have the same Caro-Kann variation, with the two knights and the capture on e4, but this time Faustino decides to mix things up a bit, and instead of playing the familiar knight b to d7, as he did in the previous game, he goes for bishop to d7, which is very unusual and already a losing move, giving Hikaru the chance to get a crushing position when the coming attack on f7 will be fatally inconvenient for black to defend. But Hikaru just reflexively plays knight to g3, which I suspect may have been pre-moved, maybe just assuming that knight to d7 was going to be next, because here knight to g3 really doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you're going to move the knight, going to c5 would be much better. You'd be hitting the bishop. But alright, we get knight to f6 from Faustino, and Hikaru, maybe realizing what he just missed out on, now puts his bishop on c4. But here the attack is not as effective. Faustino responds g6, and after knight to e5, hitting f7, he plays e6, which hems in his light-squared bishop, which is why knight to d5 was actually correct. So at this point, Hikaru is developing an advantage, and he continues queen to f3, which is good, eyeing that f7 square, although d4 followed by bishop to g5 would have been stronger, according to the engine. We have bishop to g7, d4, both players castle, at which point we get a sad admission from Faustino that something has gone terribly wrong with his development as he plays this move bishop to c8. The bishop returning home in shame, and his only accomplishment was to hinder the development of this b8 knight, which Faustino now wants to put to d7. Rook to d1 now from Hikaru, we get knight b to d7 and now b3, planning bishop to a3. It's not the best plan, but it is a decent plan, and it's not a blunder. So in bullet, that's practically a winning strategy. Now comes knight to d5, exposing the double attack on e5, which is why knight takes d7 is now best for white, but Hikaru plays his bishop to a3, allowing knight takes e5, comes with an attack on the queen, so d takes e5 is forced. The attacked rook now moves to e8, at which point Hikaru defends his attacked e-pawn with bishop to b2. Not quite as good as the more active bishop to d6, but this move is not as bad as it appears. Even though this bishop is sort of functioning like a tall pawn at this point, that's going to change very soon. Queen to c7 hits e5 a second time, and so rook to e1 defends. We get b5, good move, drives the bishop back, and it goes home to f1, which just might be best. Bishop to d3 was playable too, but Hikaru doesn't want to have to think about any knight to b4 coming at some point. Now Faustino's bishop ventures out for a second time with bishop to b7, opposite the white queen. That's always worth something, but more significant than that is this move c4, booting the knight off of its proud post on d5 after the pawn exchange, at which point black's best move is knight to b4, threatening the fork, ready to play c5 next, with tempo on the queen. But after Faustino plays knight to b6, Hikaru has time to play c5, which might just be strongest, closing the door on the bishop, but instead he goes for knight to e4, also winning and very bold since it allows c5 from Faustino. But Hikaru knows that his knight is not pinned to the queen, since knight to f6 does come with check, and after bishop takes f6, the queen can recapture while getting out of harm's way. And at this point, Faustino must be aware of the biggest problem with his position, which is of course his weak dark squares, and the issue of bishop to c1, followed by bishop to h6, threatening mate on g7. But instead of challenging Hikaru's queen like he should with queen to e7, he thinks he can get away with playing rook a to d8 first. Only trouble is, after bishop to c1 from Hikaru and queen to e7, there will be no mate on g7. However, white has a winning tactic now at his disposal, which is not difficult to spot, and that is queen takes e7, which will be followed by bishop to g5, winning the exchange. But instead, we get this move which had to be a mouse slip, and that was queen takes e6. And after queen takes e6 from Faustino, Hikaru immediately resigned. So Faustino scores a second win, which looks good on paper, but whether or not you consider this legitimate really depends on the level of importance you assign to mouse skill when it comes to online chess. But whatever you think about that, it is clear that Hikaru totally outplayed Faustino in this game. We can't fault his chess skill in this one. But now it's time to move on to the real meat and potatoes of this video. One of Faustino Oro's most incredible games he's played this year, and maybe ever, containing multiple brilliancies. This is a 3-minute blitz game against a strong 20-year-old international master by the name of Vugar Manafov, rated 2900 in blitz on chess.com. Faustino has the white pieces here and begins with e4. We have a Sicilian defense on the board, headed down the main line of the Khan variation. All theory, no surprises. b5 comes a little early. Traditionally, queen c7 is first, but it's a fairly common move, going for some early light squared control with moves like bishop to b7 and b4 on the cards. Bishop to d3 adds some defense to e4. We get queen to b6 from Vugar attacking the knight, which you could defend with bishop to e3, developing another piece, but then black can just increase the pressure with bishop to c5, which is why most players prefer the move Faustino plays, knight to b3, discouraging bishop to c5, while also threatening to get in bishop to e3 with tempo on the black queen. So the retreat of this knight to b3 didn't really lose a tempo, as is demonstrated by Vugar's next move, queen to c7, which is probably most flexible. He knows this queen is going to get booted from that b6 square anyway. Faustino castles, we have bishop to b7, and now f4, supporting a possible e5. Maybe you'll give the knight a kick if it goes to f6. You're also discouraging any bishop to d6, which is actually a good move for black in some lines, targeting h2. Next is b4, driving the knight back, goes to e2, and it removes some of the defense of e4, which is attacked now a second time with knight to f6. And here, instead of the natural space-gaining move e5, which is probably strongest, despite the fact that it lets black's knight post up on d5, Faustino defends with knight to g3, which has some positional logic to it. You're maintaining flexibility with this pawn duo. Maybe you want to go for f5 at some point instead of e5. Only problem is, this is tactically flawed. Vugar now plays a strong move h5, simply threatening h4. So Faustino adds some extra defense to e4 with queen to f3, which also prepares to meet queen to b6 check with bishop to e3. Which seems to be the reason why the engine says it would have been actually better for Vugar to play queen to b6 first, and then follow up with this move h5. But we now have h4, kicking the knight back to e2, maybe h3 is on the way. Vugar's position is now significantly better until he plays his next move, knight to c6, which allows white to equalize with h3. Black could have maintained his advantage with playing a5 instead of knight to c6, gaining space and preparing a4, driving the b3 knight backwards. But since knight c6 has blocked the queen's view of c5, Faustino can play h3 here, and if a5 happens, he's got bishop to e3, supporting knight to c5, a much more active square for this knight, and a move that wouldn't be possible without this knight on c6, blocking the queen's view. But instead of playing this equalizing h3, Faustino begins with bishop to e3, which is losing because it gives black a winning move, and that is h3. Not played in the game, but it's a move that would force white to either allow the opening of the h-file, you don't want that, or the alternative, which is to relinquish some control of f3 by pushing the g-pawn to g3 or g4. So you're going to see how that's significant in the variation that was actually played in the game, beginning with d5. We have e5, best move from Faustino, attacking the knight on f6, and now d4 with the counterattack on the bishop. So white cannot capture the pawn on d4 due to the looming discovered attack on his queen, but he can get away with taking on f6, which is what Faustino does, after which Vugar should capture on e3, with a still very complex, although apparently equal position. But instead he plays a move which would be winning if he had played h3 like we talked about, and Faustino had moved his g-pawn somewhere. And that move is knight to e5, with the discovered attack on the queen, and this would be crushing without the pawn on g2, in which case black's threats of knight to f3 check, or queen to c6, depending on where this queen now moves, would be decisive. But here, the g-pawn is still there to guard f3 and to block this deadly diagonal, which means that Faustino can just slide his queen over to h3 and everything is fine. He's a piece up for the moment, his bishop on e3 is hit, but so is that knight on e5, hence the capture on d3. At which point we have bishop takes d4 by Faustino, which superficially looks like a winner. The knight on d3 is still under attack, and there's now the additional threat of f takes g7 with the fork. But this was actually not best. Knight e takes d4 was the only really decisive move, watching over c2 and threatening a sacrifice on e6, which turns out to be much more deadly than this threat of taking on g7. The reason being that Vugar is now able to mix things up with queen takes c2, just allowing the capture on g7. Because after rook to g8, and that f8 bishop is taken out, like so, the king recaptures, and Faustino is a piece up, but he's left with a huge problem on g2. What are you doing about that? There's no defending with the rook. The knight's got that square covered. Maybe g3? Nope. Queen to c6 would be a checkmate in 5 moves. You can work that out for yourself if you'd like, but this is kind of looking like the tables are turning. Is Faustino now lost? No. He finds the only move not only to save himself from certain destruction, but to even maintain a winning advantage. Pause the video if you'd like and try to spot white's best move, but here it is. Knight to g3. You gotta give the piece back to block the g-file. Vugar, of course, captures on g3, and after h takes g3, he correctly realizes it's a good idea to move his king. But for the wrong reason. His best move here, which he doesn't play, is the counterintuitive looking king to e8, which makes life a bit uncomfortable for white. The queen is tied down to defending against the checkmate on g2, although the engine says white is still probably winning after the move f5, but his life would be a lot easier if he could play rook f to d1, planning rook to d2. But this would run into knight takes f4. The white queen is hit, and you definitely can't capture on f4, or you got the big disaster on g2. But here, if the king was still on f8, you could throw in a check with queen to h6, and then follow up with rook to d2, and be winning. That's why as black, you want your king off of f8. But in the game, instead of the correct king to e8, we have king to e7, which looks very natural. It connects the rooks, and is now threatening a double rook sacrifice beginning with rook to h8 in order to remove the queen's defense of g2. So what are you doing about that as white? It looks very serious. Well, here, Faustino finds a crushing and beautiful response to this threat. Take a moment if you'd like, but here it comes in 3, 2, 1. Rook a to c1, a beautiful exchange sacrifice. And I should note that rook f to c1 works just as well. So after knight takes c1, rook takes c1, defended by the knight, the queen goes to e4. It's as good a try as any. keeping the mate threat alive on g2. And so once again, threatening that double rook sacrifice, beginning with rook to h8. But Faustino is now able to infiltrate with rook to c7 check. Now, if you try to keep the rooks connected with king to d6, you're going to go down in flames to bishop e5 check, which will force black to either sacrifice his queen or play king to d5, which will run into a checkmate in 1 with rook to c5. That's checkmate. So the king has to move backwards. So sad. What's tried is king to e8, keeping some defensive f7, but here comes bishop to f6 from Faustino, threatening a killer check on e7, which would force the black king to choose between king to f8, which would run into a forced mate beginning with queen to h6 check, or king to d8, which would allow rook takes e6, the discovered check, winning the queen. So something clearly must be done. Vugar tries queen to b1 check, and after king to h2, he plays queen to g6. A very nice defensive try, attacking the bishop on f6, also covering h6, meaning that king to f8 can be played without that problem of queen to h6. Faustino now defends his bishop with queen to h4, and because the bishop on b7 is attacked and undefended as a consequence of the move queen to g6, it moves to d5. Now we have knight to c5. This renews the threat of rook to e7, since the king does not have a safe haven on f8 anymore because of the threat of knight to d7 with checkmate. And of course, king to d8 would still tactically fail to the disastrous discovered check. But Vugar is not going down without a fight, and he sees that this move knight to c5 has blocked the white rook's view of c2, which means he can now move the queen there, once again threatening checkmate on g2. So Faustino just very coolly plays the only move that still wins, and that is queen to h3, just defending g2 and rendering Vugar powerless to do anything about rook to e7. He plays a5 for whatever reason, or maybe no reason, but what else can he do? Faustino's rook to e7 with check is unstoppable, and it forces king to d8, since king to f8 would still run into checkmate with knight to d7. But here, the engine is giving white a mate in 12, starting with the move that Faustino plays next, rook takes f7, discovered check, to which Vugar responds king to c8. But I want to show you a really beautiful mate in 5 that would have occurred after king to e8. Pause the video if you want and try to work it out, but here's the move that white plays to kick off checkmate in 5 in 3, 2, 1. Queen takes e6, a stunning queen sacrifice. After bishop takes e6, we have rook to e7 check. King to f8 still runs into checkmate, but after king to d8, knight to b7 check, king to c8, it's now a mate in 2 with knight to d6 check, and whether black plays the king to d8 or b8, white will deliver mate with the same move, rook to b7 checkmate. So some wonderful coordination between the rook and the minor pieces, but getting back to the game, after king to c8, played by Vugar, Faustino misses his checkmate in 11, which would begin bishop to e5, but the move he plays, knight takes e6, is nevertheless totally crushing with a nasty discovered check threatened. The black king really has nowhere to hide. If you go to b8, then there's just bishop to e5. You can try queen to e2, planning on throwing the queen in the way once the discovered check happens. But at the very least, white is picking up another piece. And with the extra pawns, not to mention the continued threats of checkmate, this would be hopeless for black. So what's tried in the game is the desperado bishop takes g2. Maybe Vugar is trying to trick Faustino, hoping that he had pre-moved the knight somewhere, in which case he'd lose his queen, but no such luck. Faustino simply captures the bishop with queen takes g2, which is enough to convince Vugar to resign, being hopelessly down in material with the still horribly exposed king. So a beautiful game with some excellent defense by Vugar Manafov, keeping Faustino Oro on his toes until the very end, requiring of him the utmost precision, which he did not fail to deliver, just like you'd expect from a future world champion. So if you enjoyed this and would like to be periodically updated on the latest dazzling conquests and exploits of this young prodigy, please consider subscribing to the channel, and I will see you soon.